in what is now called fundamental theology. The basic content of fundamental theology is about revelation and faith. In other words, fundamental theology would talk about revelation, how it happened, what is the content of it, and what are we going to do when we are faced with revelation. In other words, what is our response, the response on our part, and that is the faith part. So fundamental theology before, especially before the Second Vatican Council, was speaking primarily about revelation and faith. And if this was a fundamental theology, because as you know, at the very heart of our Christian faith is, or the fundament of our theology, is precisely how God revealed himself to us. Okay, so revelation and faith. And in older courses on fundamental theology, they really spent a great deal of time on revelation and on faith and how practically we can understand revelation and from different senses of the word itself, as well as on what should be our response. Now, since we have this particular chapter in the context of our methodology, which is the see, judge, or discern, act methodology, we need to understand that this is a very, very important section of the course because it is, or it consists in the criterion on the basis of which we assess, discern, judge our current human experience. So if we're going to do theology, if we are going to do any assessment of how our human experience, but in the light of our faith, in the light of revelation, in the light of what we find in the Gospels, then we need to be sure we understand properly the Judeo-Christian tradition. What exactly do we mean by Judeo-Christian tradition? It's the same as saying, if I'm going to talk about the let's say the political structure in the country, I have to know what is the Constitution. The Constitution is a very important document because precisely it embodies the basic rationale for the country itself, why the country exists, and what are the different parts or the different institutions and structures that are part of the country. What are the laws? What are the values? What are the customs? These are all contained in the Constitution. So familiarity with the Constitution enables you to understand your own experience first, but at the same time, it enables you to continually adapt your own experience to the Constitution and vice versa, to adapt the Constitution to your own experience. And that's why we talk about amendments to the Constitution, because our experience, our ongoing experience, enables us to assess or to check whether the Constitution is still contemporaneous, or is it still relevant in our own times, or does it need to be changed? So you hear, of course, here in the Philippines, so much talk about moving from the present presidential form of government into a federal form of government. According to some proponents of federalism, there is now a need to update or perhaps change the current form of government into federalism, into federal states, precisely because we have grown so big, and there are so many other different um, things that we need to pay attention to, which are not uh, conceived of during the 1986, the conception of or the promulgation of the 1986 Constitution. And so we, according to them, it's not just, it is not sufficient to have amendments. We really need to do revision of the entire Constitution itself. And that's why they speak about charter change. Okay. All right. So that I'm just using this as an example of why it is important for us to concentrate or to devote a particular chapter in the Judeo-Christian community. So chapter six, in this chapter, we'll be talking about different things. First, we will go back to recalling the dynamic between human experience and interpretation. In this case, we're going to be talking about the dynamic involved in talking about revelation and its interpretation. Secondly, we will begin to discuss about Judeo-Christian tradition, but first with the Judeo part of the tradition, the beginnings of the Judeo-Christian tradition. And at the heart of our Christian tradition, of course, is what we call the Jesus event. Where are you? The Jesus event. The Jesus event as the pivotal horizon of Christian theology. It is what makes us Christian. So if we are going to do Christian theology, then we have to know exactly what is this Jesus event. We will not, of course, be discussing at length the Jesus event because this is a separate course in itself. This is the course on Christology. So you will still have to take that next year, in second year. But we will try to go, I'll try to go through very quickly on what exactly do we need to understand about the Jesus event in order for us to be able to use it as the basis, as the criterion for our assessment of human experience. Fourthly, we will talk about tradition of theological interpretation. Not just the Jesus event, but after the Jesus event, thousands or hundreds and hundreds of interpretations were made about first the Jesus event, or maybe even earlier about what happened before Christ itself. And this is what we would call the great traditions that we have in the church, or to use a general term, tradition without an S, tradition, meaning everything, including the scriptures and traditions, as people would speak of the smaller, different traditions found in different cultural settings. Fifthly, we will talk about criteria for a good theology. Now that we know what is human experience, what are the elements of the human experience, and now that we have also presented, we would have presented the elements of the Judeo-Christian tradition, then we will discuss about how do we do theology. What are the prerequisites? What are the qualities that we need to aspire towards if we would like to do good theology? And lastly, we're going to give examples of the revelation faith experience today. And if you go back to your syllabus, you will find that I have uh, proposed for your readings two articles, especially for 6.6. One is by Father Pilario on rituals of passion, violence, and compassion. And the other one is by Louise Marie Chauvet when he talks about sacrifice, the idea of sacrifice. These are two examples of how to do theology, taking into consideration the revelation that we have, but at the same time, applying it to into our own context. In other words, doing a contemporary theology on sacrifice as well as on rituals of passion, violence, and compassion. Now, if you read SEDMAC, you will find there all kinds of examples also on how to do theology from Latin America, from Asia, from different parts of the world. And that is why it is important that you read SEDMAC because his examples will give you an idea, a very concrete idea of what we are talking about, what we are talking about. And in that way, you can also be preparing for your third paper because that is really what is going to be asked of you when you do the third paper. Do a kind of a theology, but using uh, the perspective of the Judeo-Christian tradition in order to assess or to make sense of a particular experience that you may have. All right. So for your second paper, I ask you to talk about an experience, but you talk about the experience from the different aspects of it: cultural aspect, the socio-political aspect, the economic aspect, perhaps, or even the briefly religious aspect of it, or the philosophical aspect. So those are different aspects when talking about the human experience. But when we talk about Judeo-Christian tradition, I will be now asking you, how would you look at a particular experience, the experience, for example, of COVID, but from the Judeo-Christian tradition, using the Judeo-Christian lens that you hopefully would have acquired by the end of this chapter, so that you'll be able to do, in fact, theology already uh, in a smaller scale yet. Once you're able to do this, then you're actually equipped already with the tools for doing theology. So be be very conscious of taking note of the examples that are found in SEDMAC, because it has some very, very good examples already about how to do theology. So that is what we are going to be taking up in chapter 6 already. It's almost 30 minutes, my gosh. When you're having a good time, you up. So the dynamic of revelation and interpretation. Hopefully, I'll be able to finish this morning. Revelation, revelation and interpretation. In this section of the chapter, we will be discussing again the dynamic between revelation and interpretation, which is pretty much the same dynamic that we have seen when we talk about human experience. How revelation and interpretation are actually correlatives. You know, revelation and interpretation go hand in hand. And you interpret something, but actually there's a prior interpretation to it because of what you have in store in your bank, in your theological bank, or in your philosophical bank, or in your cultural bank, or your bank of worldview. You have already ways by which you are able to interpret almost simultaneously as you are experiencing something. But then that is the first level of interpretation. But then there's a second level of interpretation when you consciously go back to what was experienced, and then you start reflecting, and then you write the paper. That is the second level of interpretation. But the first level, you have already experienced it. And then we will emphasize the need for understanding what exactly does language, what exactly is the role of language, the role of language in all of this, especially in talking about the Judeo-Christian tradition. When I speak of language here, I do not mean, Hebrew or Greek or Latin or Bisaya or Waray or Tagalog or Indian or what is this, Tamil Nadu. I am talking about language as the expression, how you express yourself, how you articulate a particular experience. Articulation, that would be the probably uh, closest meaning of the word language. In French, that would be langage, which means really the whole apparatus of symbols, the symbolic language that we speak of. All right. Now, traditionally, how do we look at the Judeo-Christian tradition? I don't know if this is how you think. I don't know if this is how you were taught to think about the Judeo-Christian tradition, but this is traditional. When I use the word traditional, I don't have any pejorative meaning for it. All I am saying is that is what it used to be, or at least what it used to be from my perspective. It may be what it still is now for you. So we will talk about it and how we can change it. Okay? Now, the traditional way we speak of Judeo-Christian tradition is like this. We speak of the Judeo-Christian tradition in terms of a set or a complex set of divine truths that have already been revealed to us. Of course, the source of it, the Bible, the life of Jesus, and through time, of course, the teaching of the church. That is how we look at the Judeo-Christian tradition, divine truths. The church is the supreme interpreter of these truths. So, in distinction to the Protestants, for example, to Martin Luther and his company, the church in the Catholic Church, we speak of the church as the one who would interpret these truths, interpret officially what we find in the scriptures, what we find about Jesus, about what happened after Jesus died and rose from the dead, or what does it mean to say to rise from the dead. All of that has to be interpreted by the church. The theologians and the people could start interpreting in their own way, but officially, it's always the church that interprets it. Okay, that's why we sometimes hear in the traditional way, Roma locuta causa finita, which means, yes, any answer? Roma locuta causa finita. Rome has spoken, the debate is over. Causa finita. There's no more issue. In other words, the last instance in the judgment is always the church. But of course, we use the word Roma here to refer to what you see in the picture. St. Peter's Basilica, the place of the Pope. Basically, we're saying when the Pope has spoken or when the church has spoken, then the debate is finished. Okay. There's no need anymore to discuss. That is the traditional way. Okay. Nowadays, that is not a saying that is very much taken seriously in theology, because there is a kind of an open-mindedness to theology. In other words, to an ongoing discernment of what is good theology. Okay. Sometimes the church would speak as the final authority, like the church has done during the Second Vatican Council. The 16 documents of the Second Vatican Council are, in a way, the teaching of the church updated since the 1950s. So this is the updated teaching of the church. And of course, we know that the encyclicals, the teachings of the popes, and even the branches of the different congregations in Rome, when they issue instructions, when they issue a kind of a pastoral letter, they are to be taken seriously, okay? Either seriously to be debated or seriously to be implemented, okay? Now, in this traditional way, when we speak of divine truths as already been revealed, and the church as simply as the interpreter of these truths, what else is there for us to do, we who are the believers? All we need to do is to believe it, believe what the church says, and apply it to our own situation. So it's like saying, I have bought, what do you call this, polisher. And the polisher is already all fixed. All I have to do is push the button on the polisher, like you pledge, for example, polisher for a beautiful chair or a beautiful table. You squeeze the button and the spray would come out, the wax would come out. And that's all you need to do is to make the table shine with the wax itself. That is all you need to do. Don't bother changing what you find in the can, what you find in the aerosol. Don't bother changing it. There's no need to change it because it's already ready to use. Okay. So that seems like the way we speak of our Christian faith. It's ready to use or it's ready to be practiced. So all we need to do is to practice it. Whether it's true or not, well, you can debate up to a certain extent. When you are studying, you can debate it, but ultimately, this is what you need to do. Apply it to your own situation, and that's how you will find whether what the church teaches is something that is uh, according to our experience or according to the criteria uh, put forward, for example, in the Bible and in the long tradition of the church. So, if this is the traditional way, can we just accept it and then we finish our class already? We just have to do it that way. You know, whatever the church says. For example, when you talk about divine truths, where do you find it? Oh, you go to the documents. Say, for example, documents of Vatican II, Or if you want from the teachings of the church from the Bible, you go to the Bible. Or if you want to read the encyclicals, you just go to the encyclicals. And then whatever is there, then you just apply what the Pope says. So if, for example, it's Humane Vitae, it's about the Pope Paul VI issued an encyclical, Humane Vitae. And all we need to do is just follow what the church says there. Okay, so how do we assess it? Is it the right way or is there an alternative? Okay, so
Pardon, can I ask a question?
yes, you're asking a question ahead of time. Can you wait until we've about 12:15? Is it
It's okay.
what is the question about? Is it something to do with the content or the what we are discussing, or is it something other?
About the belief,
Okay, we can talk it
about
about.
the
You can ask it in 12:15. Okay, let me finish this part.
yes, yes, Father. Thank you.
Okay. Another way of putting the traditional way would be this. In popular theology, we have what we call the objective event. And the objective event is that deposit of faith that we have. The subjective part is the faith. Okay? So, as I said, all you have to do is believe. Believe that what the church teaches is right. It's true. Okay. Now, this is the idea that the church had uh, accepted, especially after the uh, Protestant Reformation, the 1500s. Because according to Luther and his companions, they have the ability to interpret what the scriptures say. In other words, if you were to read the scriptures, you will find many of the things there that are really part of our faith. Now, this is always, of course, in contrast to what at that time were considered the traditions in the Roman Catholic Church or the Roman type of Christianity. And what Luther and companions found objectionable were that some of those things who were put forward as the teachings or as the laws of the church were actually what he termed man made. In other words, made by popes, made by uh, officials, perhaps in Rome, and some of them may even contradict what the Bible was trying to say. Okay. Like, for example, in the case of the indulgences, and Luther was saying, we don't really find the teaching on the indulgences in the Bible. So, on what do we base that teaching, the teaching on the indulgence? Of course, the Roman Catholics said that the indulgence has always been part of the tradition of the church. And because it is a long tradition, then therefore it has carried on, it has an authority that is also as good as the authority of the Bible. But Luther was addressing himself to the fact that the whole tradition of the indulgences was being abused by the Roman authorities, by the Roman leaders, because the indulgences was being used in order to collect money for the building of the church that is in front of you, the St. Peter's Basilica. And they went so far as to say that for every money or coin that drops into the basket, clink, 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 at that point, a soul from heaven, a soul from purgatory goes to heaven. That is the way Johann Tetzel, the preacher for the Roman authorities, was saying in regard to the indulgences. Okay, and of course Luther was saying, you are using the Bible, you are using some of these practices for your own temporal needs and interests. At that time, of course, when you talk about the building of the St. Peter Basilica, it was not just a spiritual project. It was a project of people who were wanted to have more influence, want to have more power in the church. So that is also what Luther was trying to criticize. Now, so uh, when the Pope when the councils basically made a distinction between objective and subjective, what they were trying to preserve is that the deposit of faith has to be such that it cannot be tampered with or even interpreted by any other person or any other institution that is not officially granted the authority to interpret, which is the church or the church authorities or the leaders of the church. And of course, Luther was saying, no, every individual, when he reads the Bible, he can interpret the Bible according to how he perceives, according to how it relates to his own life. To a certain extent, that is right, but to another extent, that is also a short-sighted way of looking at it. But this is what I mean when I included here the idea of the dangers of subjectivism. When it means, when subjectivism means faith, okay, if everyone has his own faith, but when you impose your faith, which is a subjective, on other people, you may be doing something that is not being taught by the church, because it may be your objective reading of subjective reading of it rather than the objective presentation of it by the church itself. So notice that that traditional way is anchored on that kind of a structure, the objective, the subjective. Now, nowadays, when we speak about revelation, faith, in the same way that we spoke about human experience and interpretation, we speak of revelation faith now as correlatives. A revelation becomes revelation when interpreted as such by the church or the community of believers. In other words, there's a kind of a simultaneity. It comes on contemporaneously. You know, something is accepted as revealed when, at the same time, that very point when we are ready to say, "I believe," because in fact, the word "I believe" is already saying, "I acknowledge, I accept this as revelation." So until that point, that particular thing is not revelation because you have not accepted it. So, for example, we speak about revelation, all kinds of beautiful revelation that we find in the Bible. For as long as one person who is not a Christian, who is not even a Jew, does not think of it as the revelation from God, it is not revelation for him. Okay? But the minute he accepts that revelation, it becomes something important for him, something significant, on the basis of which he's going to evaluate his own life, his own human experience, and the whole what do you call this, uh, the whole institutional structure that we have in Christianity. So revelation and faith are always correlatives. Revelation becomes revelation when interpreted as such by the church or the community of believers. To give you a clear example, some people say, "Oh, there is a miracle that's happening in Lipa," etc. Some church leaders, some even bishops, have said, "Yes, the apparition in Lipa are real, 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 true." But the church waits and waits and waits and waits and waits. It's been going on since 1950s. It hasn't really declared officially that the apparitions in Lipa or the so-called apparitions in Lipa or the revelation in Lipa was really authentic revelation. Why? Because the church is not yet convinced completely. In other words, the stance of the church is usually it's better to wait and wait and wait until the proof is almost such that it is there staring you in the face, that you can say this is really what's happening. In the same way, also, when we talk about the canonization of saints, it's very difficult to prove a miracle. Very difficult. Because when you present your case, for example, in Rome, to prove a miracle, you have to have you have to convince a group of cardinals, a group of bishops, whether what really happened is a miracle. And you have a group of doctors who will try to certify whether that is really medically impossible. So it is not an easy job. So but that is precisely what is happening. The minute the body, and more often than not, they always talk about the unanimous decision of the panel. The minute they say this is an authentic miracle, then okay, it is now proclaimed as a miracle. Then the church is now ready to canonize or beatify somebody who had for in whose name this miracle had taken place. So that the idea asserting whether it is revelation is something that comes very, very slowly. For example, again, what happened to Moses in in Mount Sinai, in the burning bush? Did it really happen, or was he just making up a story, a beautiful story? Well, it seemed like the whole people of Israel, from generation to generation, had always believed that what happened to Moses was very, very decisive for them as a people. And in fact, that is the anchor of their Jewish faith, the exodus from Egypt and then going into the promised land. And in between, they were in the desert. And that the whole event of the burning bush and the Ten Commandments, and of course, the revelation uh, of Yahweh to Moses, that's all part of the Jewish faith. Now, people will say, maybe scientists will say, really did that happen? Well, if you are not Jew, you will probably not believe it. But if you are a Jew, you would believe it. And even for us Christians, we believe it. Why do we believe it? Because it is a manifestation of God's power for us. But again, if you are a Christian and you may not believe that, then you don't believe in the Judeo part. Maybe you believe in the Christian part, but not the Judeo part. So, okay. Now, again, a kind of a review. Uh, going back to our human experience, remember when we talk about human experience and interpretation, that they go together, and especially when we talk about the first level of interpretation and how important it is precisely to recognize that our language will definitely be limited language. So, for example, you have a kind of a mystical experience. And what do the mystics always say? There's never enough words that can describe what I experienced. The language always falls short because that experience becomes so overpowering. I just cannot just say it in one paragraph or in one book, like what the Gospel of John is saying. If everything that has been written about Jesus were written, then there is not enough space in the world to contain everything that has been written about Jesus. So that on the first level of interpretation on the human experience, we know that experience and interpretation go hand in hand. When we speak of the second level of interpretation, we notice, of course, that there are different dimensions already at work. Okay, aside from the dynamic process involved, we also have a whole wealth or a treasure trove of culture, beliefs, values, and customs of the historical, social, political, economic structures and institutions that exist already, all kinds of, and then for the philosophical, the theological. And only when we come to a recognition of all these different strands or levels of or dimensions of our experience, do we come up with an interpretation that is more or less credible interpretation or appropriate interpretation. So we have to bear in mind that when we interpret an experience, especially on the second level, we are carrying with us all our baggage from the past. Whether you have accepted it or rejected it already, but some of those things will already be part of who you are. And that is the same thing for the church. When we talk about interpreting a particular happening, a particular experience, whether it's a miracle or it's another apparition or whatever, you need to remember that there is a whole baggage that the church carries with it in order to be able to dissect and determine and analyze and critique what is there happening, and whether it more or less answers all the questions that we will be asking. And most of those questions will be coming from our own background, from our own customs, from our own beliefs, from what we understand to be happening, from our own psychological makeup, etc., etc. So, for example, I don't know if you've heard of the apparitions in Agoo. Remember that Judiel was that the whole idea? So they had to find out what is the psychological makeup of this person. Is he really psychologically okay, or is there some imbalance in the psychology of this person? So this is something that comes there at the back. So in interpretation, you have to be very careful. Now, Judeo-Christian tradition is precisely that kind of human experience. There are also dimensions at work in before we can interpret a revelation, before we can say yes, because when we say yes, we are interpreting. Before we can say yes to that experience, we will need to ask ourselves all these important questions, whether are they consistent with our faith? Are they consistent with the culture that we believe? And when we talk about a culture, what is the culture of that particular person? What is the culture in that particular context? And what is the culture of the bishop who is making the what do you call this, the examination or making the analysis of that particular experience? What is the context of people who are making decisions on this or on that? Those are very important questions that we need to ask. So when we talk about, for example, a theology that is acceptable, there are many different what you call criteria that we need to use in order to be able to assess this is a good theology or this is not a good theology. We cannot just say this one is not what Roma Locuta says, and therefore it is not a good theology. That is in the past. Now we know a little bit more. Okay, now I'm going to be discussing this tomorrow, the rest of this stuff, but I will stop to share now because I know you have some questions. All right. Okay, let me open the floor to questions. Somebody was going to ask first.
I would like to ask
Yes.
about